Hi everyone, I'm Maggie Christensen. If you're not familiar with my writing, I write feel-good stories, books about women who've learned to live and love in later life and the hero is worthy of them. Books with the tagline, "It's never too late to fall in love." I'm going to read to you from the first book in my current series. It's called The Life She Deserves. It's about two old friends and a new relationship, and what could possibly go wrong? I'll start off with the prologue. Joanna Slater knew the bedside vigil was nearing its inevitable end. Her best friend Alice had managed to survive through Christmas, but the doctors weren't hopeful she'd live to see January out. The cancer she'd been battling for the past 3 years was finally winning. Now, Jo sat with Alice's husband Col, one on each side of the bed, watching, waiting, the overhead fan only managing to move the already hot air around and doing little to cool the room. Jo saw Alice's lips move and moved closer to hear her friend's words. "You'll look out for Col, won't you, Jo?" Her thin hand grasped Jo's. "Don't let him grieve too much. Make sure he—" But she was too weak to continue. "Of course, dear Alice," Jo whispered. "Hush now. I'll always be here." She squeezed her friend's hand and watched as Alice's eyes slowly closed. Jo's own eyes misted, and she turned away as Col's fingers moved down Alice's cheek, and he leant over to kiss her. She stood up, walking to the window to gaze unseeingly out at the garden, which, starved of both water and Alice's ministrations, was now dry and unkempt. The small Australian country town of Granite Springs had turned into a ghost town. It was that time of year when the few families still in town headed for the local swimming pool or the river. Most had already set off after Christmas for the coast, preferring to see out the worst of the summer heat on the beach, where there was at least the chance of a cool breeze from the ocean. Jo was seized with a feeling of desolation, one she'd already had to deal with. And now, without Alice, how would she cope? She heard a gasp behind her, and turning quickly, saw Col knuckling his eyes. "She's gone." "Oh, no, Col." Jo moved to lay a hand on his shoulder, unable to stop her tears. "I know it's a blessing, but—" Tears streamed unchecked down his cheeks. "What am I going to do without her? These past 3 years." He rose, and the two clasped each other in grief, friends sharing their anguish. Jo remembered the good times, the years they'd been a foursome before Alice's illness and Jo's husband's defection. Now there were only the two of them left. Now chapter 1, which takes place 1 year later. Alice died exactly 1 year ago today, and Jo had missed her every single day. Tonight they were celebrating her life with an exhibition of her paintings. A talented artist, Alice had, before her death, extracted a promise from both Col and Jo that they'd arrange this exhibition of her work and give the proceeds to cancer research. It was a typical January morning in Granite Springs. Looking out of the kitchen window, Jo could see the heat haze glimmer on the neighbouring paddock, where a herd of goats grazed, unheeding of the glare of the sun. She was preparing breakfast when the phone rang. Seeing her elder son's face on the screen, Jo sighed. Danny would be calling to reproach her again. When had her son started to behave as if he were the adult and she were the child? "Morning, Danny. You're an early bird. No sport today?" "It doesn't start till later, Mum. You know why I'm calling. Have you thought over what I said?" Danny had said so many things to her over the past 5 years, but she knew exactly to what he was referring. "I have, and the answer's still no. I love this house, Danny. I've lived here all my married life, and I intend to live here till they carry me out." "I know that's what you said, but I can't really believe you really thought it through. You've been rattling around in that big place since Dad left, and one of those nice villas we've been building on the estate would suit you so much better. Kylie says—" Jo didn't want to hear what Kylie said. She could imagine. Her daughter-in-law had coveted this house since the first day she saw it. when Danny had brought her home to dinner to show off her engagement ring. Back then, there had been no thought of her and Danny moving into the family home, but Jo had seen the way the younger woman's eyes had wandered around the place, as if calculating the cost of everything and refurbishing it more to her taste. "I don't want to hear any more. This is a busy day for me. As you know, it's Alice's memorial exhibition this evening, and I have a lot to do. If that's all you wanted to say?" She hung up regretfully, trying to remember when she'd last had a productive conversation with her older child, the little boy who'd followed her around this kitchen, demanding to be hugged, who'd told her she was the best mum in the world. That had all changed in his teenage years, of course, but he'd still been the loving son she remembered. It had only been in the last few years, since Gordon left, that he'd started to take on this overtly overprotective role, and more recently, no doubt at Kylie's urging, insisted he knew what was best for her. He'd begun to treat her as if she was on her last legs, instead of a woman still in the prime of her life. While those thoughts were running through her head, the toast popped up. Jo spread it with lime and ginger marmalade and prepared a cup of Earl Grey tea to accompany it, before carrying both out onto the veranda. Sitting in one of the cane chairs overlooking her rose garden, she began to plan her day. This was her favourite time, when the sun hadn't yet reached its peak. Jo had always brought her breakfast out here, even when she and Gordon were together. It allowed her thinking time. Sometimes, especially when the children were little, it had been the only time she could be alone. Now, she still liked to start the day this way. It helped blow away the cobwebs, or, in this instance, the worry Danny's call had managed to create. Today, she planned to spoil herself with a visit to her hairdresser and the local beauty salon. It was something she and Alice had often laughed about, their monthly visits designed to, as Alice said, keep old age at bay. And the day would end with the event she'd been both looking forward to and dreading: the retrospective exhibition of Alice's paintings and sketches at the riverfront, the restaurant Jo co-owned with her younger son Rob. Jo's phone buzzed again. This call was more welcome. "Call," her face broke into a wide smile at her old friend's voice. I know we've got everything set up yesterday, but there's something I need to run past you. Could you drop by the restaurant this morning?" "Sure thing." Jo mentally reviewed what she'd planned for the day. Nothing that couldn't wait. Her beauty appointments weren't till the afternoon, and she'd planned to pop in to see Rob sometime during the day anyway. She'd wanted to take one last look before tonight's opening, before the room was filled with people and the paintings would hopefully be sold to eager buyers. As she drove into the car park, Jo saw Cole's car already there and hurried inside, waving to Rob as she passed through the bistro on the lower level. Entering the gallery, a large function room with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out onto the river, she found Cole standing in the middle of the room, looking somewhat lost. "Cole?" He turned quickly. "Jo, good to see you." Alice wanted, his eyes misted. "She wanted you to have one, to choose one you'd like for yourself." "I couldn't," Jo began, before realizing this was just what her old friend would have wanted. She knew which one she'd choose, and went unerringly to a small sketch of the river path below the restaurant, where the pair had often walked together. She remembered when Alice had painted it, how her friend had pointed out the two indistinct figures in the background. "That's you and me," Alice had said, "and no one else will know." "This one," she said sadly, as Cole's arm went around her shoulders, giving her a warm hug. "She thought you'd want that one, but said it had to be your choice, not hers." Jo turned to smile at him, her eyes filling with tears, which she immediately brushed away. She wouldn't want to see us weeping for her either. No. There was a pause. Then Cole spoke again. "It's hard. Sometimes I find it difficult to conjure up her face. It's only been a year, yet I know." Suddenly, it was as if Alice was there with them, telling them not to be silly, that they needed to move on, to enjoy life. Jo had promised her friend she'd help Cole arrange the exhibition and make sure he looked after himself when she was gone. She tried her best to keep to her promise, finding Call easy company. Their shared grief had brought them together, and they'd fallen into the habit of sharing a meal together Mondays and Thursdays. It was on one of those evenings she'd shared her uneasiness about Danny's urgings for her to downsize, to move into one of the modern villas on the estate on the outskirts of town, part of the new development her real estate son was marketing. Call had been supportive and encouraged her to stand firm, understanding how much Yaren meant to her, but it was hard to accept that her son and his wife wanted to turf her out of her own home, even though they planned to buy it from her. Thanks, Call. Joe accepted the glass of wine, took a sip and shifted from one foot to the other. She'd been standing all evening and would die for a seat. That was probably the wrong word to use on this occasion, but Joe wasn't in the mood to be politically correct. Alice was gone, and tonight was to be a fitting memorial, one which Alice had planned in minute detail. Joe looked around the room, seeing all their friends happily engaged in drinking champagne and chatting. Alice would have laughed and encouraged them to enjoy themselves. If she'd been here, she'd have been the life of the party, moving from group to group, her infectious laugh rising above the chatter, her smile encouraging and answering one from everyone she met. Everything had gone to plan. Here in the function room on the top floor of the restaurant, and not without a few tears, she and Call had arranged Alice's paintings. The walls were filled with the seascapes, river scenes, and bird drawings that had been her special talent, many of them already sporting red sold stickers. Gazing around, Jo caught sight of her former husband. Of course he'd be there. As Call's best friend and business partner of more years than either of them cared to remember, it would be an occasion he wouldn't miss. And there by his side, wearing the most inappropriate outfit, was his new wife. Not so new, really. It had been 5 years since Gordon had left her to marry Carol Randley. Carol Slater she was now, the second Mrs. Slater. It was just difficult to accept he'd moved on. He was now married to the blonde 30-year-old bimbo who'd arrived at his law office in a whirlwind and swept him off his feet. At least that's how he told it. Jo saw it differently. She saw a grey-haired, middle-aged man, flattered by a woman half his age into leaving a perfectly good marriage for some misplaced idea of eternal youth. Jo glanced surreptitiously at the woman who'd ousted her in her husband's affections, glad she was now able to view her without the bitterness of 5 years earlier. Back then she'd have liked nothing better than to have torn out the hair of the woman who'd arrived in Gordon's office and immediately set her cap at the senior partner. But time had brought her to her senses, made her see reason. Now she almost pitied the woman who had taken her place. "Jo, how are you, my dear?" Jo turned sharply to see the well-meaning face of Gordon and Call's practice manager smiling at her. Except for the brief period Jo tried to forget, Dot had worked for the pair ever since they'd set up in practice. Gordon had often joked she ran the office single-handed, and he and Call were only there for show. "I'm good, Dot. Just missing Alice. She'd have loved this." "Don't be too sure she's not here. Can't you feel her presence?" Jo felt a shiver run through her, though whether at the thought of Alice's ghostly presence or at Dot's words she wasn't quite sure. She put a hand to her upswept hair, glad she'd chosen to wear the new hot pink outfit she's been talked into by her daughter. Despite being mother to 4-year-old twins, Eve still managed to put in a few days a week in her fashion boutique and had insisted on helping Jo choose her outfit for the evening. "Okay, Mum?" As if thinking of her had helped her materialize, Eve was at her elbow. "I know it must be difficult for you tonight, for you and Uncle Call. Where is he?" Jo pointed to the other end of the room, where Call was in the middle of a noisy group. Although normally quiet and thoughtful, tonight he was making the effort to be more sociable. It was what Alice would have wanted. In the early years of her marriage, she and Gordon, Alice and Call, had been a foursome, dining together regularly and spending part of each weekend together. Then, after the divorce, it had been the three of them, Alice, Call, and Jo. Now only Call and Jo were left. Jo looked fondly across the room to where Call appeared to be expounding the merits of one painting over another. How delighted Alice would have been to see her normally taciturn husband in this role. Jo sighed. Alice and Gordon had been the outgoing ones, with her and Call more introverted. They used to joke that was what kept them together, until Gordon left. Finally, the crowd thinned, and soon there were only Call and Joe left. Rob and his staff had disappeared downstairs. It went well. She'd be pleased, Joe said, looking at the red sold stickers on every exhibit. I guess we should go home now, too. She glanced at her companion, seeing signs of weariness in his eyes, the lines beside his mouth more noticeable than usual. It's still early. Why don't you come back for a hot drink? Thanks. After mugs of hot coffee drunk in Joe's living room, Call rose to leave. At the door he turned, almost bumping into her. I don't think I want to be alone tonight. Joe wrapped her arms around him in a warm hug. Then stay here. They walked upstairs together, past the spare room, and into the main bedroom. Without speaking, and still fully dressed, the pair lay down on the king-size bed Joe had been meaning to get rid of ever since Gordon had left. It felt strange to have another body there. Over the past 5 years, she'd been accustomed to having the large bed all to herself, but the glasses of champagne, followed by the hot chocolate, meant she immediately fell into a dreamless sleep. As dawn was breaking, Jo awoke with a start to the awareness she wasn't alone. She turned to look at the familiar face on the pillow, and a wave of tenderness swept over her. Call moved towards her, and their lips met in what was more than their usual friendly kiss on the cheek, the one they greeted each other with when they met, had done for years. For a moment she was startled. Then a paroxysm of desire flooded her. As their bodies moved together with an urgency of their own, she had no time to wonder if this was a wise move. There was no way she could have stopped the upsurge of passion that engulfed them. And that's the end of chapter 1.